She ran into the wrong town. He told the wrong lie. And nothing in Silver Hollow would ever be the same. The marshal's horses were still kicking dust when Evelyn Cross stumbled through that door, bruised, bleeding, and burning with a secret that powerful men had already killed to keep buried. She had one breath left to beg strangers for help. Every soul in that store looked away. Every soul except one. A blacksmith nobody talked to. A man with scars he never explained stepped forward and said 4 words that changed both their lives. She is my wife. That lie was the most dangerous thing Thorne Maddox ever did, and it was the first honest thing he'd done in years. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust never really settled in Silver Hollow. It hung in the air most afternoons like something the town couldn't shake loose. Fine red grit that coated the windowsills, worked its way into the creases of a man's knuckles, settled on the rims of glasses at the dustpan saloon before the barkeep even had time to wipe them down. The town sat in a wide, flat bowl between 2 ridgelines in Wyoming territory, and the wind that came through the gap to the north carried that dust everywhere. Into your teeth, into your eyes, into every conversation held in the open air. It was the kind of town where people minded their own, mostly because there wasn't much worth minding. A general store, a livery, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist on Thursdays. 2 saloons, one for the miners, one for everyone else, though the distinction had blurred so much over the years that only the old-timers still pretended it meant something. A church with a crooked steeple that the congregation had been meaning to fix for 3 years. A forge at the east end of town that put out enough heat in summer to make the nearest building feel like the inside of a bread oven. That forge belonged to Thorne Maddox, and Thorne Maddox belonged to nobody. He'd arrived in Silver Hollow 4 years back with a horse, a bedroll, and a set of blacksmithing tools wrapped in oilcloth, and he'd asked the mayor, a wool merchant named Clarence Pruitt, who'd inherited the title when the previous mayor took a horse kick to the temple, whether anybody in town needed forge work done. Pruitt had said yes, probably. The previous smith had gone to drink himself apart down in Cheyenne, and so Thorne had set up shop, and that had been the end of any conversation about where he came from or what he'd done before. People had tried to ask, in the beginning. Silver Hollow was small enough that a new face drew attention. But Thorne Maddox had a way of answering questions that left the asker feeling like they'd received something less useful than silence. A single flat syllable, or a look that communicated without warmth that the subject was closed. He wasn't rude about it. He just wasn't open about it either. After a while, people stopped trying. He was the blacksmith. He was good at it. He showed up, he did the work, he charged fair prices, and he went home. What people did notice, because you couldn't help it, was the size of the man. Thorne Maddox stood 6'2" in his boots, and the years at the forge had built him in a way that regular labor couldn't quite replicate, wide through the chest and shoulders, with forearms that looked like something a sculptor had gone too far on, and hands that were cross-hatched with small white scars from a decade of hot metal and edged tools. He had dark hair that he cut himself badly, brown eyes that were lighter than expected when the sun caught them, and a jaw that was usually carrying 2 or 3 days of growth. He wasn't handsome in any conventional way that the women in Silver Hollow would have admitted to noticing, but several of them had noticed anyway. He kept a dog. A low-slung, gray-muzzled mutt named Pitcher that slept under the anvil and growled at anyone who got too close to the forge without announcing themselves. Pitcher was the only living thing in Silver Hollow that Thorne talked to with any regularity, and even those conversations were short. That was Thorne Maddox. That was how things stood on the afternoon of September 14th, 1878, when a woman came through the door of Harlan Briggs' general store and changed the arrangement permanently. Harlan Brigg was in the middle of arguing with old Pete Calvert about the price of salt pork when the door banged open so hard it knocked a tin of tobacco off the shelf beside it. The woman who came through was not what anyone expected. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair that had come most of the way loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, plastered against the side of her face with sweat and dust. Her dress was brown, or had been, underneath the grime. There was a tear at the shoulder where the fabric had caught on something. She had brown eyes that were moving fast, cataloging the room, counting exits the way somebody does when they've been doing it long enough that it's become reflex rather than thought. There was blood on her left forearm. Not a lot, a scrape rather than a wound, the kind you get from a fall. But it was there, dried dark against her skin, and it was the first thing Harlan Briggs' eyes went to. The second thing anyone noticed was that she was breathing like she'd been running. She wasn't a settler's wife. Her clothes were too well made for that, or had been, under the damage. She wasn't a saloon girl, wrong bearing, wrong kind of tired. She was something else, something none of the four people in that store could immediately place. And she was looking at all of them with a kind of desperate calculation that made Harlan's stomach drop a little. "Please," she said. Her voice was steadier than her breathing. "I need help." Nobody moved. Pete Calvert had been in Silver Hollow for 22 years and had seen most of what the frontier could throw at a man, and he took a slow step back toward the pickle barrel. Margaret Foss, who was buying thread and had no particular reason to be involved in anything, pressed herself a little closer to the fabric bolts on the far wall. Young Tom Aldridge, who worked part-time for Harlan sweeping floors and unloading crates, looked at the floor. Harlan said, "What kind of help?" Because he was the proprietor, because the store was his, because somebody had to say something. "I need—" She stopped, looked at the window, looked back at him. "The men following me. They're going to say things about me that aren't true. They're going to—" "Federal marshals." The voice came from outside. It was loud, practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. It came in through the walls of the store as clearly as if he were standing inside it. "Attention, citizens of Silver Hollow. Federal Marshal Wade Holt, United States Marshals Service. The woman who just entered that establishment is wanted on charges of fraud, theft, and obstruction of federal proceedings. She is considered a flight risk and potentially dangerous. Any person who aids, conceals, or provides assistance to this individual will be subject to arrest and prosecution under federal law." There was a silence in the store that had a particular texture to it, the kind that comes when several people are trying not to look at each other. The woman, Evelyn Cross, though nobody in that store knew her name yet, had gone very still. The calculation in her eyes had sharpened into something closer to despair. "Please," she said again, quieter now, looking at Harlan. "I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking, but those men out there, they work for the man who wants me dead. Not arrested, dead, please." Tom Aldridge was still looking at the floor. Margaret Foss had found something deeply interesting about the wallpaper. Pete Calvert's jaw was working like he was chewing something. Harlan looked at the woman. He looked at the door. He thought about his store, his inventory, his license to operate in the territory, the letter of credit he had out with a bank in Cheyenne that he was still 3 payments into. He thought about his wife, Dora, who was at home right now with a head cold and their youngest, and who did not need a federal complication in her life. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it. He could see it in her face. Whatever was happening to this woman was real, and it was bad. But he had a family. "I can't—" The door opened behind her. 2 men came in. They had badges. They had the particular kind of unhurried authority that comes from knowing you're going to get what you want, regardless of how long it takes. And they had guns on their hips that they weren't reaching for because they didn't need to. The taller one, the one who'd been doing the talking outside, was broad across the shoulders with a thick mustache and pale, flat eyes, the color of old ice. Marshal Wade Holt. He looked at the woman with something that was professionally neutral on the surface and ugly underneath. "Evelyn Cross," he said, "we've been looking for you for a considerable stretch." "I'm aware," she said. "You're going to come with us now." "Am I?" It wasn't a question. Her voice had changed. Something had come into it that Harlan didn't quite understand. Something that sounded almost like resignation, but wasn't, because her hands were still very slightly in front of her body, her weight slightly forward on her feet, like she was still calculating exits even though there weren't any left. "Hands where I can see them," Holt said. "Holt!" The voice came from the doorway. Everyone in the store turned. Thorne Maddox was standing in the open door of Harlan Briggs' general store, filling most of it, his work apron still on, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Pitcher wasn't with him. He'd come from the forge on foot, and his boots were leaving faint sooty prints on Harlan's clean floor, and he was looking at Marshal Wade Holt with an expression that was very, very flat. "You're in the wrong store," Holt said. He knew Thorne the same way everyone in Silver Hollow knew Thorne, as background, as scenery, as the man who fixed your tools and didn't cause trouble. "Step aside." "That's my wife," Thorne Maddox said. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely from the one before. This one had edges on it. Holt stared at him. "Excuse me? That woman." Thorne gestured with his chin toward Evelyn Cross without looking away from Holt. "She's my wife, Evelyn Maddox. So before you put hands on her in my town, I want to hear what federal charges you think you're pursuing against a blacksmith's wife in Wyoming territory." Holt's partner, shorter, younger, with a nervous energy he was trying to tamp down, looked between Thorne and the woman. "That true?" he asked her. "You're his wife?" Evelyn Cross didn't miss a beat. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look grateful. She looked like a woman reassessing a situation in real time and arriving at a decision in the space between two heartbeats. "Yes," she said. "I am." What happened in the next 10 minutes happened fast, and then slowed down, and then happened fast again. Holt didn't believe it. That was plain. He stood there with his flat, pale eyes moving between Thorne and Evelyn, and the mathematics on his face were visible to anyone paying attention. He was weighing the claim against the cost of pushing past it, measuring what he could prove against what he could get away with. And somewhere in that calculation was the awareness that they were standing in a public space with witnesses, and that a blacksmith claiming his wife was a different animal than a fleeing woman with no one vouching for her. "Maddox," he said, "I'm going to need you to think very carefully about what you're doing here." "I'm asking you to tell me what charges you're pursuing against my wife," Thorne said. Same flat tone, same stillness. "That seems like a reasonable thing for a husband to want to know." "She's wanted for fraud, theft, obstruction. She's been home with me for the past 6 weeks. Here, in Silver Hollow." He looked at Harlan Brigg with something in his expression that was not a request. "Harlan, you've seen her around, haven't you?" Harlan Brigg was not a brave man. He had established this to himself already in the last 5 minutes. But there was something happening here that he didn't fully understand. And the way Thorne Maddox was looking at him was the way you look at someone when you need them to do one simple thing and you're telling them, without words, that they can do it. Harlan thought about Dora at home with the cold. He thought about the letter of credit. He thought about the fact that he'd never in 4 years had a reason to question Thorne Maddox's character. "Sure," he said. "I've seen her." It wasn't much. It was barely anything. But it shifted something in the room. Holt stood there for a moment longer, doing his calculations. "We'll be checking your claims," he said. To Thorne, not to Evelyn. "This isn't finished." "Never said it was," Thorne replied. Holt and his partner left. The bell above the door made its small sound. Through the window, Harlan watched them mount up and ride toward the dustpan, and he stood there behind his counter, not sure whether he'd just done something decent or something extremely stupid, or whether there was a difference. The woman, Evelyn, let out a breath that she'd been holding for what looked like at least 3 minutes. Thorne looked at her. "Come on," he said. "Davis." He didn't take her to his house. He took her to the forge. It was the building he knew best, the one place in Silver Hollow where he felt like the walls belonged to him rather than the other way around. The fire in the forge was banked down to coals. He'd been in the middle of cooling a set of wagon fittings when he'd looked up and seen 2 men with federal badges riding into town from the north. And the heat it gave off was a steady, deep warmth that pressed against your skin from 3 feet away. The woman came in and looked around with the automatic assessment of someone mapping a new space. She looked at the tools on the wall, the cold iron of the anvil, the trough of water, the single window high up near the roof that let in a column of afternoon light and didn't give a view to anyone outside. Pitcher came out from under the anvil and sniffed her boots. She looked down at the dog with an expression that cracked something open in her face. Not softness, exactly, but something human and exhausted underneath the calculation. "What's his name?" she asked. "Pitcher." She crouched down and let the dog smell her hand. Pitcher's tail moved twice. She stood back up. "Evelyn Cross," she said. "Not Maddox." "I know." "You don't know anything about me." "I know Holt," Thorne said. He moved past her to check the forge fittings, not looking at her, his hands going to familiar work. "Saw him 6 years back in Kansas. He wasn't a federal marshal then. He was a hired man doing a land boss's dirty work. She was quiet for a moment. "You were a lawman," she said. He didn't answer right away. He picked up a file and turned the nearest wagon fitting over in his hand, checking the work he'd done before she arrived. "A long time ago," he said. "That's why you knew how to do that. The way you talked to him, the way you—" She stopped, seemed to be deciding how much to say. "You bought me some time, that's all it is. He's going to come back." "Probably." "You understand what you've done, what that means for you." He set the fitting down and looked at her for the first time since they'd come into the forge. "You going to tell me what's actually happening, or are we going to stand here talking around it until Holt comes through that door?" She looked at him for a long moment. She had, he noticed, the kind of face that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because too much was happening behind it at once. She wasn't simple. She wasn't easy to categorize. She was tired in a way that went down past the physical, and she was angry in a way that had been burning for a long time, and there was something else in there too, something that looked like it hadn't had anywhere to land in a while. "Sit down," she said. He raised an eyebrow. She was in his forge. "Please," she added, like the word cost her something. He sat on the edge of the work table. She stayed standing, like she needed to be able to move, and she started to talk. It had started, she told him, 3 years ago. Her father, Tobias Cross, had been a surveyor. A good one, meticulous, methodical, the kind of man who took his work personally because he understood that a survey line drawn wrong was a family's livelihood drawn wrong, and he couldn't stomach that kind of mistake. He'd worked out of Laramie for most of his adult life, mapping property boundaries for settlers, homesteaders, the territorial government. Her uncle, Gideon Cross, was her father's younger brother, and where Tobias was meticulous, Gideon was ambitious. Gideon had done well for himself in ways that people generally knew were a little loose around the edges, but didn't examine too closely. Land brokering, property speculation, the sort of dealings that required a man to be comfortable in rooms where the truth was flexible. He'd cultivated relationships with territorial officials, with certain federal appointments, with the kind of men who had power and needed someone willing to do the specific work that power required. 3 years ago, Tobias Cross had come home from a survey job in the Wind River region and told his daughter that something was wrong. Not the ordinary kind of wrong, the kind that sat in a man's chest and wouldn't move. He'd been hired to resurvey a section of land that had already been mapped. Standard enough. Boundaries shifted sometimes, old surveys were challenged, new eyes were put on old lines. But when he'd compared his findings to the original survey records, the numbers didn't match. Not close. Not within normal margin. They were off in ways that were specific and consistent. The same direction, the same magnitude, across multiple parcels. Someone had moved the lines, not the physical markers, the records. Someone had gotten into the official survey documents and altered them, and the alterations had the effect of shifting the legal boundaries of dozens of properties in ways that made certain parcels, some of them settled by homesteaders who'd put years of work into the ground, suddenly fall within the legal ownership of a land trust that had been registered 3 years prior. A land trust that, when Tobias Cross had dug into it carefully, had Gideon Cross's name nested 3 layers deep in the ownership structure. Tobias had brought his findings to the Territorial Land Office. The Territorial Land Office had thanked him and done nothing. He'd brought them to the Federal Surveyor General's office. The Federal Surveyor General had thanked him and done nothing. He'd written letters. He'd filed formal complaints. He'd documented everything. 6 months later, Tobias Cross had his surveying license revoked on grounds of professional misconduct. The stated reason was falsification of survey records. The records cited were the ones he had altered, or rather, the records that had been altered before his arrival, and that he had correctly identified as altered, and which someone in the federal system had then quietly re-altered back again, this time with Tobias Cross's surveyor mark on them. Her father had died 8 months after losing his license. Not dramatically. Not murdered in his bed, nothing that clean. He'd caught a chest infection that a man in better circumstances would have recovered from, but a man with no income and no standing and no fight left had not. He died in a rented room in Laramie with his daughter beside him, and everything he'd spent his life building in a pile of ash around him. After that, Evelyn had picked up where her father had put the work down. The difference, she said, was that I didn't go through official channels. She'd been quieter about it, smaller. She hadn't filed complaints or written letters or asked anyone in power for anything. She'd gone to the settlers, the families whose properties had been swallowed by the shifted boundaries. She'd listened to them. She'd documented their testimony, names, dates, what they'd been told, who they'd spoken to, what had happened when they'd tried to resist. And she'd found, through one of those families, a man named Corbin Vale, a former land office clerk who had left the position under pressure and was living quietly on his sister's farm outside Casper, who had personal knowledge of how the record's falsification had been carried out. He had names, he had dates, he had a ledger that he'd kept as a kind of insurance policy, documenting payments from Gideon Cross to federal officials, the specific alterations that had been made to which records, the schedule of bribery that had kept it all moving. Corbin Vale had given her the ledger. She had been on her way to a federal judge in Cheyenne, a man who she had reason to believe was not in Gideon's pocket, when the marshals had found her. "How did they know where you were?" Thorne asked. "I don't know. Someone told them." She pressed her mouth together. "Or Corbin told them. I don't know if he's—" She stopped. "I don't know if he's all right." "The ledger?" She looked at him steadily. "I have it." "Where?" "Not here. Hidden. Before I came into town." She paused. "I wasn't going to walk into a place with a full bag when I didn't know who was watching." He looked at her. There was a layer of practical intelligence to this woman that he found he'd underestimated, even knowing her less than an hour. She'd come into that store in fear and desperation, and she'd still been careful. She'd still been thinking. "Gideon Cross," he said, "your uncle." "My father's brother." "Yes." "He know you have the ledger?" "He knows I've been gathering evidence. He may not know about Corbin specifically." She rubbed her left forearm where the dried blood was. "Or he might. I don't know how much Vale told them if they found him." "How long has Holt been working for him?" "At least 2 years, from what I can piece together. There are 3 or 4 others, federal appointments mostly. Gideon spent a long time building this. He has friends in the Cheyenne Land Office, in the Marshal Service, probably in the territorial governorship. He's careful. Everything he's done is done through layers." "But you have the ledger." "I have the ledger." Thorne stood up from the work table. He went to the forge and checked the coals, not because they needed checking, but because it gave him something to do with his hands while he thought. The wagon fittings were going to be late. Jed Harmon over at the livery was waiting on them. That was going to be an inconvenience for about 6 people, and they'd get over it. "What were you planning to do?" he asked. "Before Holt found you on the road." "I told you. Judge Whitaker in Cheyenne. Elias Whitaker said he's a federal circuit court judge. Been on the bench for 11 years, no connection I can find to Gideon's network. If I can get the ledger to him personally, with affidavits from the settlers I've spoken to, there's enough to open an investigation that Gideon can't buy his way out of." "Cheyenne is 2 days' ride from here." "Yes." "Holt's going to be watching every road out." "Yes." "You'd need time to send word ahead to Whitaker, so he knows what's coming and who's carrying it, so it doesn't just disappear." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, more like a recalibration of expectations. "Yes." Thorne turned away from the forge and looked at her. She looked back at him. In the light from the coals, her face had shed some of the calculation, and what was left underneath was something worn and real. She was 25 or 26 years old, and she had been running for months, and her father was dead, and she was standing in a stranger's forge trying to figure out if he was going to turn her in. "The people whose land was taken," he said. "How many families?" "I have documentation on at least 40. There are probably more I don't know about." 40 families. He thought about what that meant. The years of work, the children born on that land, the wells dug and the fences put up and the gardens that had grown in difficult soil because somebody had decided it was worth the effort. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, "at the forge. There's a back room." He nodded toward the door in the rear wall. "It's not comfortable, but it's not visible from the street." "I don't want to—" "That wasn't a negotiation," he said. "Holt's still in town. If you walk out of here tonight, you'll be picked up before you clear the main street." She closed her mouth. "In the morning," he said, "we'll think about next steps." He picked up the wagon fitting again. "I've got work to finish." She watched him for a moment. "You don't know me." "No." "I could be exactly what they're saying I am." You could be, he agreed, but you don't think so. I know what Holt looks like when he's doing his job, Thorne said, without looking up from the fitting. And I know what he looks like when he's doing someone else's. That was someone else's. She stood there for another moment. Then she sat down on the low bench against the wall, and she was quiet, and Pitcher came and put his head in her lap without being asked, and she let him. Thorne worked at the forge until well past dark, the hammer coming down in its regular rhythm, the metal brightening and fading, the coals throwing orange light across the walls. He didn't talk, she didn't sleep, but somewhere around 9 o'clock he heard her breathing change and looked over to find her slumped sideways on the bench, with the dog still pressed against her legs, finally still. He put the wagon fitting aside, covered her with the canvas coat he kept on the wall for cold nights, went to the window and looked out at the main street of Silver Hollow, where the lights of the Dustpan Saloon were still going and Marshal Wade Holt's horse was still tied at the rail outside. He hadn't thought 4 years ago that he'd end up in a place like this again. He'd been careful. He'd been quiet. He'd done everything right in all the wrong ways, shrinking himself down until he was just the blacksmith, just the man who fixed your tools, just background, just scenery. He looked at the sleeping woman, at the dog at her feet, at the forge fire casting its long shadows. He'd looked away from a lot of things in 4 years. He'd gotten good at it. He wasn't sure he could do it anymore. Outside, Holt's horse shifted and stamped at the rail. The wind came through the gap in the ridgeline and carried the dust of Silver Hollow down the dark street, and Thorne stood at the window and watched it go, and thought about Gideon Cross and 40 families and a ledger hidden somewhere in the scrub outside of town. He thought about all of it for a long time. Then he went back to work. She was awake before he was. Thorne came through the back door of the forge at first light carrying a tin cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and Evelyn was already sitting up on the bench with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open, watching the gray light come in through the high window. She hadn't fixed her hair. She hadn't tried to look composed. She just looked like a person who had slept badly in a strange place and had been lying there in the dark thinking hard about things. Pitcher was at her feet, tail going slow. Thorne set the coffee and the cornbread on the edge of the anvil without saying anything. She took the coffee, wrapped both hands around it, didn't thank him, which he found he didn't mind. It would have felt like a transaction, and this wasn't that, or it was something, but not that. Holt's horse was gone from the rail this morning, he said, before sunup. She looked up from the coffee. Doesn't mean he left town, he added. Could mean he moved it somewhere less visible. That's what I'd do, she said. I know. He pulled the stool out from under the work table and sat. So, the ledger. Where is it? She studied him for a moment in that way she had. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone who had learned the hard way, that trusting the wrong person was a mistake you didn't always get to recover from. 1/2 mile east of town, she said. There's a dry creek bed, cottonwood fallen across it. I wrapped it in oilcloth and put it under the root end. Anyone see you out there? No? He nodded. We can't go get it in daylight. Not today. If Holt is watching, I know. Tonight, maybe. After midnight. He looked at her. You said you have settler testimony. Affidavits. Some of it written. Some of it only spoken. People who'd talk to a judge but wouldn't put their names on paper before that. They're afraid. Of Gideon. Of Gideon's reach. There's a difference. She broke off a piece of the cornbread. He doesn't do his own threatening. He has men for that. Some of them wear badges and some of them don't. Thorne was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, a door banged open and he heard the sound of Vic Harley's chickens starting their morning noise. The town was waking up. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. Holt, what I said yesterday, that I saw him in Kansas 6 years back. That's true, but it's not all of it. He put his elbows on his knees. I was a deputy marshal then, out of Dodge City. She didn't say anything, so he kept going. I had a superior, Marshal Cord Birch. He'd been on the job 15 years, decent reputation. People trusted him. I trusted him. He paused. There was a freight company operating out of the South, Halloran Transport. They were running guns to some of the range wars down in the territories, selling to both sides, moving the money through a web of shell operations. I built a case against them. 18 months of work. I had documentation. I had a witness inside the company. I had enough to put Halloran and his partners away for a long time. What happened? Birch killed the case. He said it flat, without heat. It was something he'd processed years ago into a kind of cold fact. Quashed my paperwork, had my witness transferred out of the territory where I couldn't reach him, told the federal prosecutor my evidence had been improperly obtained. He was in Halloran's pocket. Had been for years. He rubbed the side of his jaw. When I pushed back, he turned it around. Said I'd fabricated evidence. Said I'd been taking payments from Halloran's competitors to build a false case. I got investigated. Lost my position. They came close to filing charges, would have, I think, if they'd thought they could make it stick. She was watching him carefully. I came out here, he said. Learned a different trade, kept my head down. He looked at his hands. The scars, the callus, the evidence of 4 years of different work. And it was working fine until yesterday. Evelyn set the cornbread down. Was Holt involved? In what happened to you? He was one of Birch's men. I don't know how much he knew. He looked at her. But he recognized me yesterday, you see that? When he said my name, he knew it. Wasn't surprised to find me here, he just didn't expect me to be a factor. Which means Gideon's network and Birch's network may be connected. Or the same network with different faces on it. She absorbed that. Her jaw was tight. My father said the same thing, that it wasn't just one man or one scheme, it was a system. People who help each other, who cover for each other. She looked at the floor. That's what makes it hard. You pull on one thread and there are 6 more attached to it. But there's a ledger under a cottonwood root east of town that names names. Yes, she said. There is. He stood up and went to the forge and started building the fire back up because he needed to work, and because the work helped him think, and because if Holt or anyone else was watching the forge, a cold anvil on a working day would look strange. You mentioned a Judge Whitaker, he said, working the bellows. Elias Whitaker, Federal Circuit. He's in Cheyenne for his fall term, should be there through November. She was watching him work. I had a contact who was going to arrange an introduction before all this. Who's the contact? She hesitated. I'm not going to sell you out, he said without turning around. I passed that exit yesterday when I opened my mouth in Harlan's store. A short pause. His name is Arthur G. He runs a printer's shop in Cheyenne. He's been helping me document some of the settler accounts, printing copies so there are multiple records. He knows Whitaker personally. They were at school together or something like that. She paused again. I don't know if he's been approached or threatened. I haven't been able to send word. I can get a letter out through the freight line, Thorne said. Jed Harmon owes me. He runs supply wagons to Cheyenne twice a week. Next one leaves tomorrow morning. He glanced back at her. Can you write a letter that says what needs saying without giving away what it says if someone else reads it? She gave him a look that was somewhere between offended and amused. I've been doing this for 2 years. Right. The fire was catching now, the coals brightening. Thorne put his first piece of iron on, a hinge repair job that had been sitting on the shelf for a week, customer's name written on a tag of paper tied around it. He picked up his hammer. The first strike rang through the forge and out through the walls into the morning air, and it sounded like a normal day beginning, which was what he needed it to sound like. They worked in a strange, companionable quiet for a while, him at the anvil, her sitting with pitcher, the coffee getting cold. He noticed she didn't fill silence with noise. A lot of people did. She didn't. It was one of the things about her that he found himself paying attention to without meaning to. How did you end up in Silver Hollow? She asked after a while. Traveling south from Montana. Horse went lame, stayed. That's it? There was a job available. He turned the iron. Seemed like a place people wouldn't ask questions. And they didn't? For about 3 days. Then they did. Then they stopped when I didn't answer. He hit the iron again. Small towns have a memory for what doesn't fit. They file you away under odd, and eventually stop wondering about it. She seemed to think about this. Is that what you wanted? To just stop being looked at? He didn't answer right away. I wanted to stop looking over my shoulder, he said finally. Mostly achieved it. He glanced at her. Until yesterday. I'm sorry, she said. And she said it like she meant it. Not the reflexive kind, the kind people say to fill space. She said it the way someone says something when they've been carrying something heavy and they know they've just handed part of it to someone else. "Don't be," he said. "I knew what I was doing." Did you, in that moment? Because it happened very fast. He thought about it honestly. He'd been at the forge. He'd looked up and seen the badges and the horses and the dust cloud they'd ridden in on, and something old and stubborn had moved in him before he'd made any conscious decision at all. "I knew Holt," he said. "That was enough." She nodded slowly. She didn't push it further, and he was grateful for that. The morning wore on. Around 9 o'clock, someone came to the forge door. Old Hendricks, wanting to know when his plow blade would be done. Thorne spoke with him in the doorway, kept his body blocking the interior view, said the blade would be ready by Friday. Hendricks complained that he'd said Friday last week. Thorne said he was saying Friday again. Hendricks left. Hendricks. Evelyn had moved to the back room without being told, which told him she'd been in situations like this before, knew instinctively when to disappear. She came back out when the old man's footsteps had faded. "I need to know something," she said. She was standing in the back doorway, and something had shifted in her expression. The careful, neutral surface had dropped a little, and what was underneath wasn't angry, just direct. "Thorne, are you going to help me? Not just shelter me tonight and send me on my way in the morning. Are you going to help me get that ledger to Whitaker?" He set down his hammer. He looked at her for a moment. At the scrape on her forearm, dried now to a thin brown line. At the tiredness that sat in her face, even after sleep. At the way she was holding herself. Not asking for sympathy, not performing anything, just asking him a plain question and waiting for a plain answer. He thought about 40 families. He thought about Cord Birch. He thought about 18 months of work that had been buried by a man with the right connections and the wrong conscience. He thought about 4 years of keeping quiet and looking at his hands and telling himself it was enough. "Yes," he said. Something moved across her face. Not relief, too controlled for that, but something adjacent to it, like a muscle that had been braced letting go slightly. "All right," she said. "But I need to know everything," he said. "Not the version you'd tell a judge. The actual version, every piece of it. If we're going to do this right, I can't be tripping over things I didn't know." She came back to the bench and sat down. "All right," she said again. "Then I'll tell you the actual version." And she did. It took most of the morning. She talked and he worked. Not because he was dismissing her, but because the work gave both of them something to organize around, a rhythm to speak against. And she laid it out in the order it had happened. Not the order that made the best case, but the order she'd actually lived it in, which was messier and more uncertain and more real. She talked about the year after her father died, when she'd been working as a seamstress in Laramie to keep herself fed while she spent her evenings going through her father's papers, the survey documents, the complaint letters he'd filed. She talked about finding the first settler family, the Prager family, Samuel and Nora and their 3 kids, who'd lost their claim on 80 acres of creek bottom land to a legal filing they didn't understand and couldn't afford to fight. She talked about the months of work building from that first family outward, finding others, piecing together the shape of what had been done. She talked about Corbin Vale, the former clerk, nervous as a cat, who'd held on to his ledger for 2 years before she found him, who'd been offered money to stay quiet and had taken it, but had kept the ledger anyway, some stubborn knot of conscience or self-preservation he couldn't fully explain. She talked about the day he'd handed it to her, the weight of it, the particular kind of responsibility that comes from holding something people have already been hurt to protect. And she talked about Gideon Cross. She talked about him carefully, not emotionally. There wasn't much emotion when she got to him, which Thorne found more telling than tears would have been. She described him the way you describe something you've had a long time to think about and have arrived at a clear view of. He was 62 years old. He'd been in land speculation since before Evelyn was born. He had a house in Cheyenne and a ranch in the Wind River country and a reputation as a civic-minded man who donated to the Territorial Library and served on the board of a Laramie bank. He had attended her father's funeral. He had shaken her hand at the graveside and told her Tobias had been a good man, and that if she needed anything, she had only to ask. 3 months later, the marshals had started looking for her. "He knows I have something," she said. "He doesn't know exactly what. He thinks he can still make this go away. Get the ledger, get rid of me quietly, and have enough time and distance from it that it becomes just another old complaint that never went anywhere." "Can he?" He could have, she said. Before I put Corbin's affidavit in writing and sent a copy to Arthur G. If that copy still exists, she stopped. If Arthur is still all right, we'll know more once we get word to him. Yes, the afternoon came on. Thorne finished the hinge job, started on the plow blade that was late for Hendricks, kept his face and his manner ordinary for the two other customers who came by that day. Between visits, he came back inside and they kept talking, not about the evidence now, but about the logistics. Routes to Cheyenne. Which roads Holt could watch and which were too small to bother with, whether it was safer to move fast or slow, whether there was anyone in Silver Hollow they could trust. That last question was harder than it should have been. Harlan covered for you, Evelyn said. Harlan said one sentence because I was looking at him a certain way. I can't count on him to do more than that. He thought about the people he knew in town, really knew. Margaret Foss might. She's not afraid of authority the way some are. She had a bad experience with a federal tax collector about 10 years back, and she doesn't have much patience for men with badges. You're not going to ask her? No. The fewer people who know anything, the better. He paused. Doc Pryor. The doctor? He's been here longer than anyone. He's got no interest in politics, and nobody messes with the doc in a frontier town because everyone's going to need him eventually. He turned it over. He wouldn't carry messages, but if either of us needed medical attention and needed to not be seen getting it, I understand. By the time the light was failing and the forge fire needed building back for the evening work, they had something that resembled a plan. Not a good plan. There were too many things they didn't know, too many variables they couldn't account for. But a plan. A direction. Thorne went outside to pump water and look at the street. Holt's horse was back at the dustpan rail. He'd been in town all day. He came back inside and didn't say anything immediately, just washed his hands in the bucket and dried them on the cloth he kept by the anvil. Evelyn read his face. He's still here? Still here. She pressed her lips together, looked at the floor, then looked up. What about you? Does anyone in this town know your real history? Who you were before? No. But Holt knows. Holt knows I was a deputy marshal. He knows the official story, that I was removed for misconduct. He hung the cloth back up. He may or may not know the truth underneath that, but he's got enough to use it. He'll use it, she said, without hesitation. He'll use everything he has. That's how men like him operate. They don't fight you on the thing itself. They undermine your credibility first so that when the thing comes to light, no one believes you. She was right. He knew she was right. He'd watched it happen to himself once already. The careful dismantling of his reputation before anyone had even heard his evidence. We're the same then, he said. It wasn't something he'd said to anyone, ever. In that specific way. She looked at him with something quiet and serious in her eyes. Two people whose credibility someone has already worked to destroy. Yes, which means the ledger matters more than either of us. She said it plainly. If it comes down to it, if something happens, Whitaker has to get that ledger. Everything else is secondary. Nothing's going to happen. You don't know that. No, he said, but I'm not planning on it. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it was close, and it changed her face in a way that he noticed and then looked away from. Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying the dust through the gap in the ridgeline the way it always did toward evening. In the saloon down the street, someone had started playing a harmonica badly. Pitcher shifted under the anvil and sneezed. Tonight, then, Evelyn said. The ledger. Tonight, Thorne agreed. He built the fire back up. She helped him without being asked, working the bellows while he positioned the iron, and they fell into a working rhythm that felt strange only because it felt natural so quickly. Two people who didn't know each other finding the practical shape of being in the same space without explanation. The night was going to be long, and tomorrow was going to be harder. Thorne knew it the way he knew weather. Something in the pressure of the air, the specific quality of the silence from the saloon down the street where a federal marshal was drinking and biding his time and waiting for his moment. It wasn't over. It was barely started. But there was a ledger in the dark under a cottonwood root east of town, and there was a judge in Cheyenne who might still be honest, and there were two people in a forge with their reasons for fighting and nowhere left to back up to. That would have to be enough. They got the ledger at midnight. Thorne went alone. Evelyn had argued about it for 10 solid minutes, low and sharp in the back room of the forge while Pitcher watched them both with his head tilted. And he'd won the argument not by being louder, but by pointing out that one person moving through scrubland at night was invisible, and two people moving through scrubland at night were a sound. She didn't like it. She gave him the directions twice, the second time slower and more precise than the first, and then she stood in the back doorway and watched him go, and he didn't look back. The creek bed was where she'd said. The cottonwood was where she'd said. The ledger was there in its oilcloth wrapping, damp on the outside from 2 days of ground cold, dry inside. He tucked it under his coat and came back the long way, cutting wide around the south side of town, avoiding the dustpan in the main street, coming at the forge from the back alley. She was waiting exactly where he'd left her. She took the ledger from him and unwrapped it on the work table with the same careful hands you'd use on something that could break. And they stood together in the low forge light, and she walked him through it. Names, dates, dollar amounts written in a clerk's meticulous hand. The entries went back 5 years. Gideon Cross's name appeared 14 times in the first 30 pages. Federal Land Office officials, a Marshall District commander in Laramie, 2 names Thorne didn't know and 1 name that he did, not from his own case but adjacent to it, a man named Fetter, who'd been a territorial auditor in Dodge City during the Halloran investigation. He pointed at the name. Evelyn looked at it. "You know him." "Know of him. He was asked to review the financial records in my case. The review came back clean." He paused. "Now I know why." She was quiet for a moment. "How far does this go?" "Far enough that we need to be careful who we hand it to. Whitaker has to be the right man." "He is," she said, but she said it like she was reinforcing her own certainty rather than informing him. They rewrapped the ledger, and Thorne put it in the false bottom of the tool chest under the workbench, a cavity he'd built himself, originally without any particular purpose, the way a man sometimes builds a hiding place simply because the option seems worth having. He pressed the panel back into place and slid 3 heavy files over the top of it. The letter to Arthur G. had already been written. Evelyn had done it that afternoon while Thorne worked. 2 pages of dense, careful language that said almost nothing on its face and everything underneath it if you knew what you were reading. She'd folded it inside a second letter addressed to a dry goods supplier in Cheyenne, a fictional order for thread and buttons, and sealed the whole thing with plain wax. In the morning, Thorne walked it to Jed Harmon at the livery before the town was properly awake. Jed was a lean, weathered man with a permanently skeptical expression and no interest in other people's business, which was exactly what made him useful. He took the letter without looking at the address, put it in the bag with his other freight, and said the wagon left at 7. "Anything I should know about this one?" he asked. Not curious, just practical, the way men who move things for a living learn to assess a job. "No," Thorne said. "All right," Jed said. That was the sum of it. Back at the forge, things settled into a suspended, grinding kind of waiting. Thorne worked. Evelyn stayed out of sight during business hours, used the time to write out as much of the settler testimony as she could from memory. Names, locations, dates, the specific ways families had lost their claims, in case the documented versions she carried were challenged or lost. She wrote in a small, economical hand that filled pages quickly. Pitcher stayed close to her. By the 3rd morning, the waiting had a different texture to it, harder, more compressed, because Holt was still in Silver Hollow, and he'd stopped being patient. The change announced itself the way these things usually did, not with a dramatic incident, but with a shift in the air. People on the main street who'd previously just nodded at Thorne started finding reasons to look away. Harlan Brigg, when Thorne came in for salt and tobacco, served him in a silence that was different from his usual silence. Loaded, uncomfortable, like a man who'd been told something and didn't know what to do with it. "Something you wanted to say to me, Harlan?" Thorne asked. Harlan kept his eyes on the counter. "Marshall came in yesterday," he said. "Asked me some questions about you, about your wife." "What kind of questions?" "About how long she'd been in town, whether I'd actually seen her here before." He finally looked up, and there was something apologetic in his face that he was trying to tamp down. "Thorne, I said what I said the other day because I don't know why I said it, but I'm not going to lie to a federal marshal a second time. I've got my family to think about." "You didn't lie," Thorne said. "You said you'd seen her around. That's not a lie." "It's close enough to one." Thorne looked at him for a moment. Holt tell you anything else? Harlan's jaw worked. He said you weren't who you said you were, that you'd been a lawman who'd been removed for cause. He paused. He said the woman had federal charges pending against her that were real, that she'd defrauded settlers, taken money from homestead families claiming she could help them, and then disappeared with it. There it was. Thorne kept his face even. You believe that? I don't know what to believe, Harlan said, which was at least honest. She's trying to get stolen land back to those families, Thorne said. The charges are fabricated by the man whose operation she's exposing. He held Harlan's eyes. That's the truth. I know how it sounds coming from me. You'll have to decide what you make of it. He took his salt and tobacco and left. Holt's counter-narrative was working. Thorne had expected it, had told Evelyn it would happen, had warned her that this was always how it went. They couldn't fight in the open yet, so they fought with perception, with rumor, with the particular cruelty of turning a person's reputation into a weapon before they could defend themselves. He told her that evening what Harlan had said. She received it without surprise, with the tight-jawed steadiness of someone absorbing a blow they'd already braced for. How many people do you think he's talked to? Enough. The story will be around the whole town by tomorrow. He sat on the edge of the work table. It's designed to isolate us. Make sure no one here would stand up for you if it came to a public confrontation. Is it working? He was quiet for a moment. Some. Margaret Foss came by this afternoon while you were in the back. She pretended to be asking about getting her kitchen knife sharpened. What she was actually doing was checking to see whether I looked like a man who was lying about his wife. What did she decide? She left the knife. Evelyn almost smiled again. That same almost that didn't quite make it. The letter to Arthur, she said. The wagon left 3 days ago. If it gets there intact, could be another 4 or 5 days before we hear back, if we hear back. She knew that. She nodded, turned back to the page she'd been writing, and then stopped, set the pen down, looked at her hands. My father used to say that the worst part of doing the right thing isn't the risk, she said. It's the waiting. The part where you've done what you can do and everything's out of your hands, and you just have to sit there. He was right, Thorne said. He was right about a lot of things. She picked the pen back up. Didn't save him. Thorne didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't try to give one. The next day was the 5th since her arrival, and it was the day that Gideon Cross rode into Silver Hollow. Thorne was at the anvil when he heard the horses. 4 of them, coming up the main street from the south at a pace that said they weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. He looked through the window and counted. Holt was with them. A second marshal he hadn't seen before. 2 men in civilian clothes who had the posture of hired muscle. Arms slightly out from their sides, eyes moving the way men's eyes move when they're paid to move that way. And at the center of the group, on a gray horse that probably cost more than everything Thorne owned, was a man who could only be Gideon Cross. He was older than Thorne had pictured from Evelyn's description, though he shouldn't have been surprised. 62, she'd said. He had white hair under a good hat and a suit that belonged in a Cheyenne drawing room, not a Wyoming frontier town. He was large, not in Thorne's way, but in the way of a man who'd been well-fed his whole life and had the slow, settled weight of someone accustomed to things going as planned. He didn't look like a villain out of a story. He looked like a bank president. He looked like the kind of man who sat on charitable boards and spoke at civic functions, and was described in the territorial newspaper as a pillar of the community. He looked around Silver Hollow with the mild, assessing interest of a man pricing a property. Thorne set down his hammer. He went to the back room. Evelyn was at the small table with her papers, and she looked up at his face and knew immediately. He's here, she said. Not a question. Just rode in. 4 men with him, including Holt. She went still for a moment. Something moved through her face. Not fear, not quite. Something older than fear. He came himself. That means something? It means he's decided he can't trust anyone else to handle it. She stood up and pressed her hands flat on the table like she was steadying herself against a ship's movement. It means he thinks I have something he can't risk leaving in other people's hands. She looked at Thorne. He knows about the ledger. He must. Corbin Vale, Thorne said, or someone watching Arthur G. She pressed her eyes closed for a moment, opened them. He can't search the town himself. He needs a legal pretext. That's what Holt is for. He'll push the arrest, claim federal jurisdiction, and once they have me in custody, the ledger disappears. She looked at the tool chest across the room. He'll search everywhere I might have been. They'll search the forge, Thorne said. Yes. We need to move it. Where? He thought fast. Not the livery. Too obvious, and Jed would fold under federal pressure. Not Harlan's store, for the same reason and more. Margaret Foss was possible, but he'd be putting her in direct danger. Doc Pryor. Doc Pryor, he said. His office is behind his house, separate building. He has a locked medicine cabinet the size of a wardrobe. Territorial law says no one opens a physician's locked pharmaceutical stores without a county court order. Holt's got federal jurisdiction. Wrong court. He was already moving. I need an hour. You don't have an hour, Evelyn said. He just rode in. He'll want to move quickly, so there's no time for us to prepare. Then I need 30 minutes. She looked at him. What do I do? Stay here. Don't go out. If Holt comes to the door, he paused. You're my wife. You've been here. You're not going anywhere. Thorne. I know, he said. I know what I'm asking. She held his gaze for a second. Then she nodded, once, short and firm. He took the ledger from the tool chest and put it inside his shirt and went out into the street. He didn't run. Running attracted attention, and the main street of Silver Hollow had more eyes on it than usual this afternoon. People stepping out of shops, pausing on their way between errands, drawn by the spectacle of 4 horses and a man in a Cheyenne suit. Gideon Cross had dismounted in front of the dustpan and was talking to Holt in the low, deliberate way of a man giving instructions. Thorne walked east along the secondary street, the one behind the main buildings, and came at Doc Pryor's house from the back. Clarence Pryor was 71 years old and had been doctoring on the frontier since before Wyoming was a territory, and he had the comprehensive, unhurried calm of a man who had seen so many varieties of human crisis that very little impressed him anymore. He answered the back door in his shirt sleeves with a coffee cup in his hand and looked at Thorne with the specific expression he reserved for patients who came to him with things they didn't want anyone else to know about. You look like you're in a hurry, he said. I need you to hold something for me. What kind of something? The kind that certain federal marshals would very much like to get their hands on. Pryor looked at him for a long moment. He took a sip of his coffee. Come in, he said. It took 7 minutes. Pryor asked 2 questions. Is this evidence of a crime? And is the crime yours? And Thorne answered no to the first and no to the second, and that was enough for the old man. He put the ledger in the back of the locked medicine cabinet behind 3 bottles of laudanum and a set of surgical instruments, locked it, and put the key in his vest pocket. I haven't seen you today, Pryor said. No, Thorne said. You haven't. He went back to the forge the way he came. He'd been gone 19 minutes. He knew because he counted them. Evelyn was at the front window when he came through the back door. She turned, and he saw in her face the particular relief of someone who'd been trying not to think about what they'd do if a person didn't come back. Done, he said. Gideon's been to Harlan's store, she said. I could hear it from here, raised voices. Harlan's mostly, sounding like a man who doesn't want whatever conversation he's having. She paused. And there's something else. About 10 minutes after you left, there was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 12, walked past the forge window 3 times. 3rd time he stopped and looked straight at the window. She paused, like he'd been told to check if someone was in here. Whose boy? I don't know him. It didn't matter whose boy. What mattered was that Gideon Cross had been in Silver Hollow for less than an hour and had already mapped the forge's occupancy. That was efficiency. That was a man who traveled with the system. 20 minutes later, they came. Not Gideon. Gideon Cross did not come himself. He sent Holt and the second marshal and one of the civilian men, and they came through the front door of the forge the way men with authority come through doors. Not knocking, just opening. All 3 of them moving into the space with the practiced displacement of people who understand that physical presence is half the argument. Holt looked around the forge, looked at the cold anvil, looked at Thorne standing at the workbench with a file in his hand as if he'd been doing finish work, which he had been, because it was the most normal thing he could think to do. Looked at Evelyn, sitting on the bench against the wall with her hands in her lap. Mrs. Maddox, Holt said. The way he said the name made clear he wasn't endorsing it. Marshall, she said. The way she said the word made clear she wasn't endorsing that either. We need to search these premises. He held up a paper. Federal writ. Thorne took the paper and read it. It was real, or real looking, which was almost as good for immediate purposes. Federal seal, the right language, Holt's name and designation. What are you looking for? Thorne asked. Documents pertaining to ongoing federal proceedings. The writ specifies written records, ledgers, and correspondence. My business records are in order, Thorne said. Knock yourselves out. He stepped aside. They went through the forge with the methodical thoroughness of men who'd done this before. The tool chest was opened, sorted through, put back. The shelves, the back room, Evelyn's papers, her written settler testimony. They took the papers. Thorne watched Evelyn watch them take the papers. Her face was level. He knew what it cost. The civilian man crouched by the tool chest and pulled it out from the wall and looked at the back of it and found nothing. He pushed it back, looked under the workbench, looked in the cavity where the bellows pump mechanism was bolted. Came up empty. Holt watched his man work and then looked at Thorne and knew. Thorne could see it, the specific tightness around the eyes of a man who suspects he's been outmaneuvered but can't prove how. We'll be taking the written materials, Holt said. Those are my wife's personal papers, Thorne said. They're evidence in a federal matter. Thorne looked at Evelyn. She gave him a small, almost invisible shake of her head. The papers mattered, but they weren't the ledger. They had copies, or had had copies with Arthur G. and Cheyenne, and the ledger was the thing. Fine, Thorne said. They left. The civilian man was last out, and he paused at the door and looked back at Thorne with something flat and assessing in his expression. Not a lawman's look. A different kind. The kind that says, this isn't over, and I'll remember your face. Thorne held the look until the man left. Then he went and stood beside Evelyn, and they stood together in the forge that had been searched and not broken, looking at the space where her papers had been. They'll tell him they didn't find it, she said. Quiet, matter of fact. He won't believe it. No, Thorne said. He'll move to the public confrontation. He'll want to force the arrest in front of the town so it looks official, and there's no room for you to claim spousal protection. She turned to look at him. He'll come himself this time. He won't send Holt. Thorne thought about that. About the gray horse and the Cheyenne suit and the mild proprietorial way Gideon Cross had looked around Silver Hollow like he was pricing it. Then we don't run from it, he said. She looked at him. What? You've been running. It hasn't worked. Every time you run, you're confirming the story he's telling about you. He turned to face her fully. If he wants a public confrontation, we give him one. We stand there in front of this whole town and we make him say out loud what he's doing. We don't have the ledger in hand. Whitaker hasn't responded to the letter. We have nothing to back the claim. We have Pryor. Pryor has the ledger locked in his cabinet. That's not the same as having it in hand. No, Thorne said, but it's in this town, and Whitaker might be closer than we think. She looked at him steadily. What do you mean? I sent a second letter, he said, with the first one, not to Arthur G. He paused. I sent it to Whitaker directly, through Jed's freight, addressed it to a law office in Cheyenne that I know forwards to the circuit judges. He paused again. I told him what you had, what it documented, that you were here and you were in danger. He watched her face. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it would get through, and I didn't want to give you something to hope for that might not materialize. The expression on her face was complicated. There was something sharp in it, a flash of being managed, of decisions made around her rather than with her. And he understood why, and he let her have it. You should have told me, she said. You're right, he said. I should have. A moment passed. She looked away, looked back. How long ago? Same morning as the G letter, 5 days. Then he may have it by now, or he may be 2 more days out. She pressed her hand flat against the workbench, the way she'd done against the table when she heard Gideon Cross ride in, steadying. If Gideon forces the confrontation tomorrow, then we stand in the street and we say the truth loud enough that the whole town hears it, and we trust that Whitaker is coming. He met her eyes. I know that's not much. It's terrifying, she said. Yes, he said, but you're right that running hasn't worked. She exhaled. Something settled in her. All right, if it comes to it tomorrow, we stand. Outside, the evening was coming down over Silver Hollow in long blue shadows, and somewhere on the main street, Gideon Cross was in the Dustpan Saloon eating a meal and planning his next move, and the town around the forge was quiet, with the specific quiet of a place that has sensed something is coming and doesn't know yet which way to look. Pitcher came out from under the anvil and put his head against Evelyn's knee. She put her hand on the dog's head and didn't say anything, and neither did Thorn, and the forge fire burned low between them in the cooling dark. Morning came in gray and cold, the kind that settled into your joints and didn't move until well past noon. Thorn was up before light. He built the forge fire not because he intended to work, but because the action of building it was familiar. And familiar things helped when the rest of everything was uncertain. He fed Pitcher. He stood at the window and watched the main street come slowly visible in the early light. The dustpan sign, the barber shop, the church with its crooked steeple. And he thought about what the day was likely to bring and tried to make himself ready for it. Evelyn came out of the back room at first light, dressed and her hair pinned up. She hadn't slept much. Neither had he. They didn't discuss this. She made coffee on the small stove in the back room, the second time she'd done it, having found where he kept the tin on the second morning, and simply started doing it without comment, the way people fall into small domestic habits when they're sharing a space and there's no ceremony about it. She brought him a cup and kept one for herself, and they stood at the window together and drank it and watched Silver Hollow wake up. "He'll come this morning," she said. "He won't wait."
"No," Thorn agreed. "What do we do until then? We act like it's a regular day." She looked at him sideways. "Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for 4 years," he said. She accepted that and drank her coffee. At 7:30, Thorn went to Doc Pryor's back door and knocked twice. Pryor answered in his coat this time, already dressed, as if he'd been expecting the visit. "Still there?" Thorn asked. "Still there," Pryor said. He studied Thorn's face with the diagnostic eye that was probably just a reflex by now, reading people's conditions the way other men read weather. "You're expecting trouble today." "I'm expecting the man who owns the trouble to come collect it in person." Pryor was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything you need from me besides the holding?" Thorn thought about it. "If things go sideways and someone needs medical attention, I'll be available," Pryor said, with the flat practicality of a man for whom that was simply a professional statement. "One more thing," Thorn said. "If a federal circuit judge comes through that door today or tomorrow and asks you to produce what you're holding, you produce it." Pryor gave him a long look. "You're expecting a judge." "I'm hoping for one." "There's a difference." "I know," Thorn said, "but the ledger needs to transfer from your hands to his directly. Not through me, not through anyone else. Directly." "Understood." Pryor put his hand in his vest pocket and touched the key that was there. "Go on then." Thorn went back to the forge. The morning passed in that stretched, elastic way that time has when you're waiting for something you can't hurry. Thorn worked. He finished the plow blade he owed Hendricks because it seemed important to finish what he'd started, and he was in the middle of a wheel hub repair when he heard the first change in the sound of the street outside. A shift in the quality of voices, people stopping and gathering the way they do when something is about to happen that they sense they should witness. He set down his hammer. Evelyn was already at the window. Gideon Cross was coming down the main street on foot this time, unhurried, Holt on his left, and the second marshal on his right, and the 2 civilian men a few steps behind. He walked like a man who owned the ground under him. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just settled into the absolute assurance that whatever happened next would go his way because things always went his way. People came out of the barber shop and the feed store and stood on the edge of the street. Margaret Foss was visible outside the dry goods, shielding her eyes. "He's made it a public event," Evelyn said. "That was always the plan." She turned from the window. Her face was composed in a way that cost her something. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the slight pallor under the road dust and the forge smoke. She wasn't fearless. She was afraid and doing it anyway, which was the only kind of courage that actually meant anything. "Ready?" she said. "No," he said honestly. "Me neither." She exhaled. "Let's go." They went out the front door together. The street had more people on it than a regular morning. Whether word had gone out deliberately or whether the town had simply
sensed the shape of what was coming. There were 30 or 40 people in the street and along the boardwalk. Miners and shopkeepers, and the women who ran the boarding house, and Tom Aldridge from Harlan's store standing near the back with his hands in his pockets. Harlan himself was in front of his store. Margaret Foss had moved closer. Gideon Cross stopped walking when Thorne and Evelyn came out. He looked at them with an expression that was mild and pleasant and wrong in the way a painted window is wrong. The light falls on it, but doesn't come through. "Mr. Maddox," he said, his voice carried easily, "and Evelyn." He said her name with a familiar weariness, like a man addressing a child who'd been difficult for a long time. "I was hoping we could settle this quietly." "You brought 4 men and rode 2 days," Thorne said. "That's not what quiet looks like." A small sound from the crowd. Not laughter, something less comfortable than that. Gideon looked at Thorne with mild interest, the way a man looks at an obstacle he's already calculated the path around. "You're the blacksmith who claims to be her husband." "I'm the blacksmith who is her husband."
"Yes." Gideon let the word sit there. "That will be addressed. But first, Evelyn." He turned his attention back to her. "The documents you've been carrying, I'm told you don't have them with you any longer. I'd like you to tell me where they are." "I don't have any idea what you're talking about," Evelyn said. "The ledger, Evelyn." His voice didn't change, didn't harden or sharpen. That pleasantness just sat there like something wrong in a room you couldn't immediately identify. "Corbin Vale's ledger. He told me he gave it to you. I want it back." "If Corbin told you that," she said, "it was because you were threatening him." "Corbin is being cooperative," Gideon said. Something about the way he said it made several people in the street shift their weight. "Which is what I'd encourage you to be. You're young. You've been misled about the nature of your father's situation. There's still a way through this that doesn't end badly for you." "My father's situation," she said. The composure cracked a little, not wide, but enough. "His situation was that he found out what you'd done and you destroyed him for it." "Your father made accusations he couldn't support," Gideon said, steady as stone. "And unfortunately, his professional judgment suffered as a result. That's a painful thing. I understand that." He said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed, the sympathy as hollow as a stage prop. "But his mistakes aren't yours to perpetuate. You altered survey records and stole land from 40 families." A long silence. The street was very still. Even the horses at the rail had gone quiet. Gideon Cross looked at his niece with that same pleasant expression, and there was something underneath it now that Thorne could see from 10 feet away. Not anger, not yet, but the first shadow of a man who is accustomed to controlling rooms and is feeling the control slip. "Marshal Holt," he said. Holt stepped forward. "Evelyn Cross, I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, theft, and obstruction of federal proceedings. I'm going to need you to come with me." Thorne moved, not a dramatic gesture, just a step forward and to the side that put him between Holt and Evelyn. Holt stopped. "You're going to want to step aside," Holt said. "Tell me something," Thorne said, loudly enough that the street could hear it. "The warrant. Who issued it?" "Federal Circuit." "Which judge?" Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "Judge Morris Calloway, out of Laramie." "Calloway." Thorne let the name sit. "That's interesting, because Judge Calloway's name appears in a ledger of payments made by Gideon Cross to federal officials over the past 5 years. I haven't seen it personally, but I know where it is and I know a judge who'll want to look at it." That was the gamble. Saying it out loud in the street. Putting it in front of witnesses. Gideon Cross's pleasant expression was gone. "You're making a serious allegation," he said, and his voice had changed, still controlled, but the warmth was stripped out of it, and what was underneath was harder and older and more used to getting what it wanted. "I'm stating a fact," Thorne said, "the same way your niece has been stating facts for 2 years while you've been trying to bury her." "You don't know what you're involved in," Gideon said. He looked at Thorne with the full weight of a man who was accustomed to being underestimated by people who were about to be crushed. "You're a blacksmith in a nowhere town with a buried history that I could bring to light in about 10 minutes. I know who you are. I know what happened in Dodge City, and I know that a dismissed lawman with a misconduct finding on his record is not going to be believed over—" "Over you?" Thorne said. "A respected man, a civic pillar."
Someone who shows up at his brother's funeral and shakes hands over the coffin of the man he killed? He kept his voice level. That the kind of credibility we're talking about? A sound went through the crowd. Different from before. Darker. Holt's hand had moved to his gun without him apparently deciding to move it. The second marshal had done the same. The two civilian men had spread slightly apart, the way trained men do when they're preparing for a situation to go physical. Thorne was aware of all of it. He was aware of every exit, every angle, every person on that street. It was like a room he'd been in before. Not this specific room, but one with the same proportions, the same specific gravity. He'd been a lawman for 12 years before Cord Birch had ended that. The instincts didn't leave. "Holt," he said, without taking his eyes off Gideon. "I want you to think about something. Think about what comes after this. If you arrest her today and the ledger surfaces tomorrow in front of a federal circuit judge, and it will, your name is in that ledger, not Gideon's name only, yours." He paused. "How long have you been doing his work? 5 years? 6? There's a point where a man can say he was following orders, and there's a point where he's too deep for that to save him. You might want to think about which side of that line you're standing on." Something moved in Holt's face, quick and then gone. "Don't listen to him," Gideon said sharply. The sharpness itself was a tell, a crack in the composure. "Holt, do your job." Holt looked at Gideon, looked at Thorne, looked at Evelyn, and then from the south end of the main street came the sound of horses. Not 4 this time, more. 6, maybe, moving at a road pace. The steady, purposeful pace of travel, rather than the display pace of arrival. People on the street turned to look. The horses materialized out of the morning dust, and at their head was a man of about 60 with a neat gray beard and a dark coat and the particular self-contained authority of someone who did not need an audience and did not perform for one. He pulled up his horse in the middle of the street and looked around Silver Hollow with the eyes of a man assessing a situation he'd been briefed on. Evelyn made a sound beside Thorne, very small, barely audible. "Whitaker," she said. Judge Elias Whitaker dismounted with the ease of a man who'd ridden hard ground his whole life and handed his reins to one of the 5 men behind him. All of them, Thorne noticed, wearing federal deputy badges that were not from the local marshal service. He looked at Gideon Cross first, then at Holt, then at Thorne and Evelyn. "I see I'm timely," he said. Gideon Cross looked at the judge with the expression of a man who had just watched a calculation he'd been running for years come apart at the seam. "Elias," he said, and his voice had recovered most of its composure. "I didn't know you were making a trip out this way." "No," Whitaker said pleasantly. "You wouldn't." He looked at his deputies. "Take Marshal Holt and Marshal—" He glanced at the second marshal. "Your name?" "Briggs," the man said, barely above a whisper. "Marshal Briggs. Take them. Don't let them near their saddlebags." The deputies moved. Holt went rigid, his hand still on his gun, and then something shifted in him. The specific shift of a man who has done a rapid calculation about his odds and arrived at a number he doesn't like. He took his hand off the gun. The deputies flanked him. He let himself be taken to the side of the street. Gideon Cross looked at Judge Whitaker with something that was no longer pleasant and no longer composed. It was just old and cold and ugly. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said. "Any investigation into my affairs would require— I have a duly authorized federal investigation into land fraud, bribery of federal officials, and obstruction of justice in Wyoming territory," Whitaker said, without raising his voice. "The authorization was granted by the Attorney General's office 12 days ago. I've been in the field since. Your name appears 17 times in the materials provided to my office." He paused. "Would you like me to continue?" Gideon Cross said nothing. The 2 civilian men, the hired muscle, looked at each other with the particular expression of men who are reconsidering their professional affiliations at speed. One of them took 2 slow steps backward and stopped when one of Whitaker's deputies looked at him. Whitaker turned to Evelyn. He looked at her for a moment with the direct, unsentimentalized assessment of a man whose business was evidence and who was therefore looking at her as a piece of the picture he'd been building. Not unkind, just clear-eyed. "Miss Cross," he said, "I received a letter from a Mr. Arthur G. in Cheyenne 10 days ago, and a second letter through a law office the following day. I understand you have materials of significant evidentiary value." "I do," she said. Her voice was steady.
Thorne noticed the steadiness and knew what it cost. A ledger documenting payments and instructions. It's in this town, in safekeeping. I'd like to examine it. It's with Dr. Clarence Pryor, Thorne said. His office is the building behind the house at the end of this street. He's holding it in a locked cabinet. He's expecting a judge. Whitaker looked at Thorne. Something passed across the older man's face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. And you are? Thorne Maddox. I'm the blacksmith. You sent the second letter? Yes. Whitaker studied him for a moment with those clear eyes. Former law? Former deputy marshal out of Dodge City. I know something about what happened in Dodge City, Whitaker said carefully. Then you know the official account isn't accurate, Thorne said. Whitaker held his gaze for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. Not a ruling, not an absolution, just an acknowledgement. We'll address that. Not now, but it'll be addressed. Take me to the doctor, Whitaker said. They walked, Whitaker, two of his deputies, Thorne, Evelyn, down the side street to Pryor's office, and the town watched them go. Harlan Brigg had come off his porch and was standing in the middle of the street with his arms folded, looking at Gideon Cross, who was standing very still with two federal deputies at his shoulders, and his pleasant expression gone for good. Margaret Foss was watching from in front of the dry goods, and when Thorne passed her, she gave him a single, firm nod. The kind that means I see what happened here and I won't forget it. Pryor answered the door before they knocked. He'd been watching through his window. He produced the key from his vest pocket, opened the cabinet, and handed the ledger to Judge Whitaker in both hands, like the careful transfer of something that had already cost several people significantly. Whitaker took it, opened it, stood in Pryor's small office and read for 4 minutes without speaking. His two deputies stood at the door. Thorne and Evelyn stood near the wall and waited, and the waiting was a different kind now. Not the hollow, grinding waiting of the past 6 days, but something else, taut and specific. Like the moment between a hammer falling and the sound reaching you. Whitaker looked up. He looked at Evelyn. The affidavits from the settler families. Where are the written ones? The marshals took them when they searched the forge yesterday, she said. But I have the names and the content from memory. I can rewrite them. She paused. And there are 3 families who I believe would speak before your court directly, in person. That can be arranged. He looked at the ledger again, turned a page. Calloway's name is in here. Yes, she said. That's going to be a problem for several people, Whitaker said. Dry, stating a fact. Yes, she said again. He closed the ledger and held it at his side. He looked at Thorne. The misconduct finding from Dodge City. Were you aware that Cord Birch has been under federal review for the past 8 months? Thorne was quiet for a second. No. He has. Your case, what happened to your case, it's part of that review. Whitaker said it carefully, like a man who knows he's handing someone a complicated thing. I can't promise you any specific outcome, but I can tell you that the record of what happened to you is not closed. Thorne didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the floor, then at the window, then at nothing in particular. 4 years of building a life over the top of something wrong, and here it was being acknowledged in a country doctor's office by a judge he'd written a letter to 6 days ago. All right, he said. It was all he had. They went back out. The main street of Silver Hollow had changed shape while they were gone. Gideon Cross was seated, not by choice, by the practical direction of 2 deputy marshals, on the bench outside the barber shop. Holt and the second marshal were standing against the front of the dustpan with their weapons removed. The 2 civilian men were talking to each other in low, rapid voices a few feet away, apparently trying to construct an account of themselves that positioned them as barely involved. The townspeople were still there, most of them. They'd stayed, which told Thorne something. Silver Hollow had looked away from a lot of things, the way small towns do when looking away seems safer than seeing, but they were still here now and they were watching, and that mattered in a way he couldn't entirely quantify. Whitaker walked into the middle of the street. He had one of his deputies read, from a document, the charges being placed under Provisional Federal Arrest Authority. Fraud, land theft by falsification of federal records, bribery of federal officials, obstruction of justice, conspiracy.
The list went on for a while. Whitaker's deputy had a flat, even voice that carried without effort, and each charge fell onto the street like a stone dropped into still water. Gideon Cross sat through all of it with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, and something in his face that was completely unreadable. Not the pleasantness, not the coldness, just a kind of absolute internal stillness that might have been calculation or might have been the particular silence of a man watching his life's architecture come down around him and not yet having any response proportionate to it. When the deputy finished, Whitaker spoke. "Miss Cross," he said, loud enough for the street to hear. "The charges filed against you in federal proceedings under warrant 1878-314, issued out of the Laramie Marshall District and signed by Judge Morris Calloway. Those charges are hereby suspended pending full review of the circumstances of their issuance. You are not under arrest. You are not a fugitive. You're free to move through this territory without restriction while the investigation proceeds." The street was quiet. Evelyn stood very still beside Thorne. He couldn't see her face from the angle he was at, but he saw her hand, hanging at her side, close into a fist and then slowly open again. Not free yet, not fully. There was a long road still. Courts, testimony, the grinding machinery of federal proceedings that could take months or years. Gideon had lawyers and money and connections that would fight every step. The stolen land would take time to return. Calloway's name in the ledger would pull a thread that went further than anyone yet knew. But she was standing in the street of Silver Hollow in the morning light with no warrant on her head, and the man who'd put her father in an early grave was seated outside a barber shop in Wyoming territory with federal deputies at his shoulders. It wasn't a clean ending. Nothing about it was clean. But it was the beginning of something being made right, which was more than she'd had 6 days ago. Whitaker crossed the street and spoke to Thorne quietly. "I'll need you in Cheyenne in 3 weeks," he said. "Both of you, for the formal proceedings." "We'll be there," Thorne said. Whitaker nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "The lie you told in the general store," he said, without expression. "I was briefed on it. For the record, that kind of lie has a way of becoming complicated." "I'm aware," Thorne said. Whitaker almost smiled. It was a small thing, a brief thing, and then it was gone. 3 weeks, he said, and went to talk to his deputies. Thorne stood there in the street. Pitcher had somehow found his way out of the forge and was at his heel, which meant the front door had been left ajar, which meant he was going to need to check whether the dog had gotten into the cornbread in the back room. Evelyn was standing a few feet away, looking down the length of Silver Hollow's main street. The dustpan, the barber shop, the store, the church with the crooked steeple. And she was looking at it with the particular expression of someone who is trying to understand how a place they've been in for 6 days has become, inexplicably, somewhere. She turned and found him looking at her. 3 weeks in Cheyenne, she said. That's what he said. And after that, he didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure she expected one. She was asking the question that was sitting at the edge of everything, the one that hadn't had space to be asked while they were surviving. He looked at her standing there in the street with her hair coming loose from its pins the way it usually did by mid-morning, and the scrape on her forearm still faintly visible in the morning light, and the look in her eyes of a person who had been running for so long that standing still felt both like relief and like the most frightening thing in the world. "I don't know," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Something settled in her face. Not disappointment, more like a person accepting a true answer over a comfortable one, which he was beginning to understand was how she generally operated. "All right," she said. Pitcher sneezed. She looked down at the dog. The almost smile came, and this time it made it quiet, real, brief. But there. "Let's go check on the cornbread," she said. The cornbread was fine. Pitcher had knocked a tin cup off the shelf and eaten half a strip of dried meat that had been sitting on the backroom table, but the cornbread was untouched. Small mercies. Evelyn found the cup on the floor and put it back without comment, and Thorne checked the forge and the tool chest and the front latch out of habit, the automatic inventory of a man making sure his space was still his space, and then they were just two people standing in a forge in the late morning with the events of the last hour sitting between them, like something neither was quite ready to put words to. Outside, they could hear Whitaker's deputies moving Gideon Cross and the marshals to whatever holding arrangement had been organized. The sounds were ordinary: boots on packed dirt, a horse shifting, a brief exchange of words that didn't carry through the walls. The sounds of something being dealt with, processed, reduced from a threat to a procedure. It should have felt like more. Thorne thought it probably would, later. Right now it just felt like quiet where noise had been.
"I need to write to Corbin Vale," Evelyn said. She was standing at the work table, not sitting, turning the empty tin cup over in her hands.
"If he's still reachable. I need to know if he's all right, and if he is, he'll need to know what happened today." "Whitaker's people will have been in contact with him already," Thorne said. "If he's part of the investigation."
"Maybe,
"But he gave me that ledger because I asked him. Because I sat across a kitchen table from him, and I told him that what he knew mattered and that keeping it to himself was a kind of burial." She set the cup down. "He deserves to hear from me directly." Thorne didn't argue with that. She was right, and more than that, it was the kind of thing that told him something about who she was underneath the running and the calculating and the 2 years of stubborn, grinding work. She thought about the people in the margins of things, the ones who didn't make it into the formal record. "I'll get you paper," he said. The rest of that day was quieter than any day in the previous week had been. Whitaker's party was staying at the boarding house at the north end of town. He'd sent 2 of his deputies ahead by a day to make arrangements. And the judge himself spent the afternoon in the room he'd taken there, reviewing materials and apparently writing a considerable number of his own letters. The town absorbed his presence the way frontier towns absorb the presence of authority figures, cautiously, with sidelong attention, waiting to see whether the authority intended to complicate things or simplify them. Gideon Cross and the marshals were being held in the single-room structure behind the boarding house that Silver Hollow technically called a jail, though it had only been used twice in the past 3 years for anything more serious than a drunk miner sleeping off a bad night. It had a solid lock, which was the main thing. Holt was in there too. Thorne thought about that briefly and then put it aside. Holt had made his choices across whatever number of years he'd been making them. Thorne had his own accounting to deal with. That evening, Whitaker sent a deputy to the forge to ask whether Thorne and Evelyn would come to the boarding house after supper. They went. Whitaker was in a small parlor that the boarding house owner, a Mrs. Addie Crane, who had the unflappable pragmatism of a woman who'd run a frontier boarding house for 15 years, had cleared of its usual furniture and set up with a table and chairs, apparently having decided that a federal judge warranted at least the appearance of an office. Whitaker had the ledger open on the table. Beside it was a stack of papers that Thorne recognized as some of the materials Holt's search had taken from the forge. Evelyn's handwritten settler testimony. They'd been returned. "Sit," Whitaker said. They sat. He walked them through what the investigation had and what it still needed, and what the next weeks would look like. He was thorough and he was direct, and he didn't treat either of them like peripheral figures in someone else's story, which Thorne noticed and appreciated more than he would have expected to. The ledger, combined with the documentation Evelyn had assembled, and the materials Whitaker's own investigators had gathered in Cheyenne over the past several months, was enough to move forward. Gideon Cross would be transferred to Cheyenne under federal escort within 2 days, where he'd be formally charged. The process would be long, and it would be fought at every step. Gideon had resources and lawyers, and, Whitaker said flatly, probably 3 or 4 friends in positions of influence who hadn't been named in the ledger and who would try to create procedural obstacles. That was the nature of it. "It will not be quick," Whitaker said. "I want to be honest with you about that. These things are not quick." "I know," Evelyn said. "The land question is even slower. Getting title returned to the affected families requires a separate proceeding, civil rather than criminal, and that will move at a different pace on a different calendar." "But it will move," she said. Whitaker looked at her. "Yes, it will move." She nodded, and something in her settled that was different from the settling Thorne had watched happen throughout the day. This was deeper, more permanent, like a thing that had been braced for a long time finally finding it didn't have to be braced anymore. Then Whitaker looked at Thorne. "The matter of your dismissal from the Marshal Service," he said. "I've reviewed what I have, which isn't complete. But I want to tell you directly, the investigation into Cord Birch has uncovered sufficient evidence to conclude that the misconduct finding against you was fabricated. Birch falsified the documentation. The witness against you was paid." He paused. A formal exoneration is a process that will take some time and will require your participation. But I'm telling you now, in front of Miss Cross, so there are witnesses to the fact that I've said it, the record will be corrected. The room was quiet. Thorne sat with that. He didn't know what he'd expected to feel when someone in authority finally said those words. He'd thought about it sometimes, in the early years in Silver Hollow, late at night when the forge was cold, and there was nothing to do but be honest with himself about what he was carrying. He'd imagined something dramatic, something large. What he actually felt was tired. And then, under the tired, something that had been clenched for 4 years let go. And what was underneath it was so ordinary that it almost surprised him. Not triumph, not vindication, just the plain, unglamorous relief of a man who has been told the truth he already knew but couldn't prove. "Thank you," he said. Whitaker nodded once. No ceremony, just the transaction of a man who did this work because it needed doing. They were back at the forge by 9 o'clock. The night was cold, clear, a half moon sitting above the ridgeline and putting a thin silver light on the rooftops of Silver Hollow. Pitcher met them at the door, tail moving, apparently having forgiven the world for the indignity of being left behind. They didn't talk much. There wasn't, strangely, that much to say. The important things had been said in the parlor, or in the street that morning, or across the days of working and waiting in the forge. They'd covered a lot of ground in 6 days, the kind of ground that takes most people months or years, because circumstances had compressed it, and there'd been no option to be slow about it. Evelyn sat on the bench with her hands around a cup of water and looked at the banked forge coals. 3 weeks, she said after a while. To Cheyenne. Yes. And then testimony, and then more waiting while the case moves. Yes. She turned the cup in her hands. Where do you go in between? The question was direct in the way she usually was, with the particular quality of someone asking because they actually want the answer rather than because it's the polite thing to ask. He thought about it honestly. I don't know that I go anywhere, he said. I've got work here. Hendricks is already annoyed about the plow blade. Jed Harmon needs wheel work done before the weather turns. He paused. Silver Hollow's a small town. It's not much, but I built it, and I know it. She looked at him. That sounds like you're telling yourself something. Not me. He considered that. Maybe. She looked back at the coals. I've been on the road for 2 years, she said. Laramie, Casper, Cheyenne, 6 other places in between. I don't have a room I rent anymore. I let it go 8 months ago when I knew I'd be moving. My things fit in 2 bags. She paused. I don't know what stopping looks like. I'm not sure I remember. I thought I didn't either, Thorne said. When I came here, I thought I was just stopping long enough to let the horse's leg heal. He looked at the forge. Horse was fine in 3 weeks. I stayed anyway. Why? He thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. Because I was tired, he said. And because the work was honest. And because nobody here knew anything about me, and I could decide every morning exactly how much of myself to carry and how much to put down. She was quiet for a moment. Did it help, putting it down? Some things, not others. He looked at her. The things that need doing don't go away because you're not doing them. She held his eyes for a moment. There was something in her face that was not the calculation he'd learned to read or the composure she wore like armor, but the actual person underneath both of those things, tired in a bone-deep way, but not broken. Someone who had chosen, over and over, to keep going, not out of some heroic refusal to quit, but simply because the alternative was letting the wrong people win, and she couldn't make herself accept that. He understood that specific kind of stubbornness very well. My father's survey tools are in a storage office in Laramie, she said. I've been paying the fee every month. I don't know why exactly. I'm not a surveyor. She paused. But they were his, and throwing them away felt like saying the last thing he did didn't matter. It mattered, Thorne said. I know that. I just needed someone else to know it too. She set the cup down. That's all any of this was, really. Not revenge. Not, I wasn't doing it to punish Gideon. I was doing it because 40 families lost what they built, and my father lost everything trying to say so, and none of it could matter if no one ever knew it happened. Thorne didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand, an unguarded, unglamorous gesture, the gesture of someone who has simply been awake and alert for too many days in a row.
I should sleep, she said. Yes, he said. She stood, and Pitcher got up with her, and she looked down at the dog with that same expression she'd had on the first night, something human and exhausted cracking through the surface. He's been mine since the second morning, she said. I didn't plan that.
He makes his own decisions, Thorne said. She almost smiled. Made it this time, a little more than before. Then she went to the back room. Thorne sat at the forge for another hour. He didn't think about anything specific, or rather, he let himself think about everything without trying to organize it, the way you sometimes have to let a room be a mess before you know where to start. Whitaker's words, the exoneration that was coming, the 4 years of building something careful and small over the wreckage of something he hadn't deserved to lose. The 6 days that had taken the careful small thing and shaken it until all the loose parts showed. He didn't arrive at any conclusions. He went to sleep without any. The next 2 weeks were not the clean aftermath of a story that had finished. They were the beginning of something grinding and administrative and frustrating. The actual machinery of justice, which looked nothing like justice looks in the telling of things, and a great deal like paperwork and waiting and conversations with men in offices who needed the same information they'd already been given, but in a different format. Whitaker's party left Silver Hollow with Gideon Cross and the arrested marshals 2 days after the confrontation on the main street. Before he left, Whitaker met with Thorne and Evelyn one final time and walked them through what they'd need to bring to Cheyenne and what they'd need to be prepared to say. And he was careful and thorough, and he treated them like people whose participation mattered to the outcome, which it did. Gideon Cross, leaving Silver Hollow under federal escort with his wrists in irons and his good suit dusty and his gray horse left at the livery, did not look at Evelyn as he passed. She didn't look away from him. That was the difference between them. The civilian men, the hired muscle, had been interviewed by Whitaker's deputies and released on the condition of testimony. They were not principals. They were tools. Whitaker had bigger concerns than tools. Holt was a different matter. He was transferred with the others, but Whitaker's face, when the marshal's name came up in conversation, had a specific quality that suggested Holt's accounting was going to be thorough and not gentle. Silver Hollow adjusted. Small towns do this in specific ways. They don't have dramatic moments of collective reckoning. They don't gather in the square and make speeches about what they should have done differently. They adjust through the accumulation of small interactions, revised attitudes expressed sideways rather than directly, the gradual repositioning of the town's understanding of its own recent history. Harlan Brigg came to the forge 3 days after Whitaker left. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and told Thorne that he was sorry he hadn't done more, and that he understood if Thorne didn't want his business anymore, and that he'd told his wife Dora what had happened, and Dora had said some pointed things about what kind of man her husband was. "What did you tell her?" Thorne asked. "I told her she wasn't wrong," Harlan said miserably. Thorne looked at him for a moment. "The salt and tobacco I got last week, I never paid for it in the commotion. Let me come by this afternoon." Harlan blinked. You don't need to." "You said one sentence when it mattered," Thorne said. "That's something. Bring it forward, not backward." Harlan put his hat back on and left looking slightly less like a man who'd been carrying a stone in his chest. Margaret Foss was characteristically more direct. She came by the forge on the 4th morning, ostensibly to collect her sharpened kitchen knife, and said to Evelyn, "I've been here 19 years. I've watched men in authority do what they like because people are afraid, and I'm ashamed I was one of the afraid people on that particular day." She said it cleanly, without dramatic embellishment, the way a woman who has made an honest self-assessment delivers it. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Margaret nodded, took her knife, and left. Tom Aldridge, the young floor sweeper from Harlan's store, came by with less ceremony and more honesty. He was 19 years old, and he told Evelyn straightforwardly that he'd looked at the floor because he'd been scared, and that he'd felt bad about it since. And he wanted her to know. "Good," Evelyn said. Not meanly, just directly. "Feel bad about it. Then the next time you're in that situation, you'll know what looking at the floor costs." He nodded, serious, and went back to work. He'd be thinking about that for a long time. That was probably the point. The day before they were due to leave for Cheyenne, Thorne went to the survey records office in Silver Hollow, a small filing office attached to the back of the mayor's building. and asked to see the property boundary records for the parcels affected by Gideon Cross's alterations. The clerk, a young woman named Ruth, who was methodical and incurious, pulled the records without comment. He sat at the desk and went through them, cross-referenced what he knew from the ledger with what was on file, made a list of discrepancies, set places where the territory's records still reflected the fraudulent boundaries, places where the legal instruments would need to be challenged and redrawn. It was surveyor's work. He was a blacksmith, but someone needed to understand the shape of it before it went in front of a civil court, and Evelyn couldn't do it alone. He brought the list home and showed it to her. She sat at the work table and went through it slowly, and her face did something complicated. "Where did you get this?" "Records office." "When?" "This morning, while you were at Pryor's." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me you were going." "No." He paused. "I should have." She recognized the echo of the second letter he'd sent without telling her, of his habit, not malicious, not dismissive, just old and ingrained, of doing the next necessary thing without consultation. She'd called him on it then. She didn't call him on it now. She just looked at him for a moment with those eyes that saw through the surface of things. "I know why you do it," she said. "It's not because you don't value what I think. It's because you spent a long time operating alone and it became the default." "Yes," he said. "It's going to be an adjustment," she said. "Yes," he said again. She looked back at the list. "This is good work." A pause. "Thank you." They left for Cheyenne the following morning at dawn. 2 horses, Thorn's Gray, and a roan he'd borrowed from Jed Harmon, with the understanding that it would come back in better condition than it left. The ledger was in a saddlebag, wrapped twice in oilcloth. The written materials were in a second bag. Pitcher sat in front of the forge and watched them go with his tail making slow, uncertain movements, and Thorn had arranged with Hendrix's oldest son to feed and water the dog while they were gone. The road south was 2 days of open country, prairie, and scrubland under a sky that got bigger the further you got from the ridgelines. They rode mostly in silence the first day, comfortable silence, the kind that develops between 2 people who've been in close quarters long enough that silence doesn't require explanation or apology. The second day there was more talking, some of it about the testimony, about what Whitaker had prepared them to expect, some of it about other things. She told him about her father, the actual man, not the surveyor who'd uncovered the fraud, but Tobias Cross as a person. How he'd been meticulous to the point of occasional absurdity, how he'd kept 3 separate copies of every document he ever produced, how he'd had a habit of reading aloud from reference books at the dinner table under the apparently sincere belief that this was enjoyable for others. Thorn told her about being 23 years old and taking the deputy marshal position, and thinking that the law was a clear and principled thing that needed only honest people willing to enforce it. He said it without bitterness. It was just the understanding he'd had once, before he'd learned it was more complicated than that, which was an understanding most people arrived at eventually. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Law work." He thought about it honestly. "I miss having the authority to do something when I see something wrong," he said. "I don't miss the institution." She was quiet for a moment. "Whitaker offered you something, didn't he? When he spoke to you alone for a few minutes before we left." He glanced at her. "You noticed that?" "I noticed things." He had. Whitaker had asked, briefly and without pressure, whether Thorn had considered that his skills and his knowledge of the territory might be of use to the investigation going forward. Not a formal appointment, not a return to the marshal service, which Whitaker had clearly assessed Thorn wouldn't want. Something more lateral, advisory, work that needed doing by someone who knew what they were looking at. He asked if I'd be interested in helping identify other cases with similar patterns, Thorn said. The Halloran transport situation in Dodge City. There may be others. Will you? He'd been thinking about it for 2 days. Probably, he said. Some of it, anyway. He looked out at the prairie rolling south. Not all at once. She nodded, didn't push. Cheyenne was 3 weeks of proceedings, depositions, formal testimony, and the specific exhaustion of being taken through the same events repeatedly by different people with different needs. Evelyn gave her testimony 4 times before a federal examiner who was thorough and patient, and twice before a stenographer whose writing made a sound like birds pecking at tin. The settler families, 9 of them, made the trip to Cheyenne, The Prager family among them, Samuel and Nora with their 3 children, testified formally. Samuel Prager was a large, weathered man who spoke slowly and carefully, and whose testimony, delivered without drama in a plain room before a federal examiner, was one of the most damning things Thorne had heard in 3 weeks of damning material. Not because it was dramatic, because it was specific. The exact date his family had received the legal notice. The exact words the land office representative had used. The exact amount they'd been offered to stop contesting and go quietly. He shook Evelyn's hand afterward and said, "Your father started this." "Yes," she said. "We knew him, some of us. He came to our land. He saw what had been done." The weathered man looked at her with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, too complicated for a word that simple. He didn't have to care. He just did. She held the handshake a moment longer than necessary. Then she let go. Gideon Cross, across those 3 weeks, was processed through the machinery of federal criminal prosecution with the methodical efficiency that Whitaker's office brought to things. He had lawyers, 3 of them, from Cheyenne and Denver, and they were good, and they fought every document and every testimony and every procedural point that could be fought. Gideon himself sat through all of it with a composed, distant expression that showed nothing and conceded nothing, and Thorne looked at him across the formal room once and understood that the man had simply retreated to whatever place inside himself where he kept the thing that allowed him to do what he'd done for 20 years and feel nothing about it. That place didn't have a name that Thorne knew. It was just what happened when a person chose, repeatedly and consciously, to treat other people's lives as a resource to be used. Eventually, the habit calcified into character, and the character had no exits. The formal exoneration of Thorne's dismissal from the Marshal Service was filed during those 3 weeks, not as a dramatic pronouncement, but as a document, a correction to the record, a few paragraphs of dense bureaucratic language that amounted to, "What was said about this man was false." Whitaker handed him the filed copy in a hallway outside a hearing room. Thorne folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and kept walking. He'd thought he might feel something large when it happened. He'd been wrong about what he'd feel. What he felt was the same plain thing he'd felt when Whitaker first told him. Not triumph, just the quiet, unglamorous relief of something set right. The record would reflect the truth. He was not the man the official story had made him. He'd always known that. Now the paper knew it too. It wasn't everything. It didn't undo the 4 years, didn't give him back what those years might have been, didn't restore the cases he'd built and the work he'd done before Cord Birch had buried it. Some things that get taken don't come back in the shape they left. But he was a blacksmith in Silver Hollow, Wyoming territory, and that was the thing he'd chosen and built himself. And it wasn't nothing. They rode back to Silver Hollow in early November, the cold coming down from the north for real now, the grass going brown across the flats, the sky that high-pressure blue that only happens in the west in autumn. The ride was 2.5 days, and they talked more than they had on the way down, which made sense. They'd had weeks of other people's words, and now their own felt like something worth spending. She told him she'd written to Corbin Vale from Cheyenne. He'd written back. He was alive, he was with his sister, he was frightened but intact. He would testify if he was needed, and in the meantime he was going to try to put one foot in front of the other, which was, she said, the most honest answer anyone had ever given to the question of what comes next. She told him she'd also written to the storage office in Laramie and asked them to keep her father's survey tools another 6 months, and she'd paid the fee. "What are you planning to do with them eventually?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but I keep thinking about the families whose land needs to be resurveyed. The legitimate boundaries need to be reestablished, and that work needs to be done by someone." She paused. "I told you I'm not a surveyor." "You're not," he agreed, "but I know survey records better than most surveyors do." She looked out at the country ahead. "And I know which families need the work done and who's currently in a position to pay for it and who isn't." She was quiet for a moment. "I learned everything from watching my father. I was with him on surveys from the time I was 10 years old. I can read a theodolite, and I can calculate a bearing, and I know every way a boundary record can be falsified because I've had to learn how to detect all of them." Thorne listened. "I'm not saying it's a plan," she said. "I'm saying it might be a direction." "Sounds like a plan," he said. She glanced at him. The wind had taken her hair loose again, the way it always did in open country, and she'd stopped trying to keep it back. "Don't make it too straightforward. I'm still working it out." "I know," he said. Silver Hollow came visible in the late afternoon of the third day. The gap in the ridgeline first, then the dust, then the shapes of the buildings coming up out of the flat country. The church steeple, still crooked. The dustpan sign. The forge at the east end with the faint smoke rising from it, where he'd banked the coals before he left. Pitcher was outside the forge when they rode in, sitting in the dirt with his gray muzzle pointed down the road like he'd been there a while, waiting. He got up when he saw them, and his whole back end moved with his tail, and he made the short, private sound he made when something was right that had been wrong. They dismounted, and Thorne took both horses to the livery, and Evelyn went inside the forge, and when he came back she had the fire built up already, the coals glowing, the warmth pressing out from the open door into the cold afternoon. He stood in the doorway and looked at that. She was at the workbench, looking at the jobs that had accumulated in his absence. Notes left by customers, pieces left for repair, the ordinary accumulation of a working blacksmith's life. She was reading each note with the methodical attention she brought to everything, and she'd taken her coat off and hung it on the wall hook and rolled her sleeves to her elbows, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had found a room that fit them and hadn't yet acknowledged it because acknowledging it would make it a thing that could be taken away. He understood that feeling very well. "The Hendricks Plowblade note has 3 exclamation points," she said, without turning around. "He seems committed." "He's been waiting since October," Thorne said. "Then I'd start there." She turned, looked at him. "If you're planning to work today." The light from the forge came through the door behind her, warm and orange and real. Outside, Silver Hollow made its small sounds. Someone hammering something on the main street, Vic Harley's chickens, the wind through the gap in the ridgeline carrying the last of the autumn dust. He thought about 40 families, about a ledger and oilcloth under a cottonwood root, about a lie told in a general store that had turned into something neither of them had planned, which was maybe the most honest thing about it. The best things usually didn't start with a plan. They started with a person refusing, for whatever stubborn and imperfect reason, to look at the floor. "I'm planning to work today," he said. He came inside. The door didn't close all the way. The latch had been slightly bent ever since a delivery horse had backed into it 3 years ago, and he'd meant to fix it and never quite gotten to it. The cold came in at the edges. It always did in this forge, in this town, in this particular life he'd built in the bowl between 2 ridgelines. He picked up his hammer. The plow blade wasn't going to be quick. Hendricks had let it go too long, and there was a crack in the metal near the heel that needed to be addressed before the straightening could happen. Real work. The kind that took time and attention and wasn't going to look clean when it was done, just functional, which was usually what you needed anyway. Some things you could not undo. The years of hiding. The people who'd lost land and time and the specific kind of hope that comes from believing the ground under your feet is yours. Tobias Cross in a rented room in Laramie. The weight of all of it was real, and it did not evaporate because a judge had filed the right documents. But you could build over the top of it, not to cover it, not to pretend it wasn't there, but the way you build on broken ground when it's the ground you have. Carefully. With attention to what the soil will hold and what it won't. With the understanding that what you make won't be perfect, and that imperfect in standing is better than perfect in theoretical. Thorne put the plow blade in the coals. Evelyn sat at the workbench and opened the ledger copy that Whitaker's office had returned, and she began to make the first list of properties that would need resurveying when the civil proceedings were ready to move, starting with the Prager family's 80 acres of creek bottom land, because they'd been first and that mattered, and because somewhere under the legal tangle of falsified records, their claim was real and honest and it had been there all along, waiting for someone willing to say so. Pitcher settled under the anvil. The forge fire burned. Outside, the cold came down from the north the way it always did, carrying the dust of Silver Hollow out through the gap in the ridgeline and across the open country beyond. And the town made its small, ordinary sounds, and the afternoon light moved across the floor of the forge in the slow way of things that aren't going anywhere. That was enough. For today, it was enough. And in the end, that is what courage actually looks like. Not the moment in the street, not the standoff with the badges and the guns and the watching crowd. Those moments matter, but they pass. What remains is the smaller, less visible thing. 2 people going back to work in a cold forge on a November afternoon, choosing not to run, choosing to stay with the hard and unglamorous labor of making something right. Nobody writes songs about that part, but that part is where the real living happens.